A variety of funeral homes and cemeteries have served the people of Plainfield over the years. Recently, the library took a closer look at them, both the existing and the long gone, in order to learn more about the city's history. We're now going to show the spreadsheets we were able to create and share some of the stories we discovered about this fascinating topic. We're going to begin, as always, on the library's homepage, which is given on the handout, plainfieldlibrary.info. We want to click on the drop-down menu under Departments and choose Local History. Then choose Collections Index. This is the Collections Index page. The best way to reach our destination today is through the Genealogy tab. The Genealogy tab offers us a lot of options. What we want now is lower on the page. The 10th and 11th items on the page are the Local Records Index and Transcriptions option, which would take us to a page which includes the funeral home records, and an option to take us there directly. But right now, we want to go to one of the new spreadsheets. We'll start with the one for funeral homes. This is the top of the spreadsheet, which we see here running from Beckett just down to DeMott. For each funeral home, the entry starts with the name, and that's followed by the contact information if they're still in operation. Address or addresses is next. When a year is given in parentheses in the address field, that's the year that we know the funeral home was there. Brown's was at 506 West 4th Street in 1922 and at 317 Plainfield Avenue in 1924. We give starting and ending years of operation when we have them. The ones in brackets are ones we think are right but haven't been able to confirm. And the final notes column includes anything we hope might be useful. Please consult the library if you're interested in further information. There's more available than we can include in this webinar. Where did the information come from? A lot of different places. City directories are a great source, and the Plainfield directories are all digitized and searchable on the library website. Here we have an advertisement for Scarpa from the 1955 directory. It provides their address for that time and tells us that they had 3 other locations. It also looks like they're one of the many family funeral home businesses. These 2 advertisements are from our local newspaper. Nelson B. Rumsey catches your attention because their ads stress that they were a low-cost option. Although it's true that these ads both ran during the Depression, when money was tight for most people, the ads of other funeral homes at the time did not tend to promote their inexpensiveness. This Higgins ad from 1924 shows additional locations in New York and Elizabeth. Newspaper articles about the firm show that Elizabeth may have been where brothers James J. and Charles A. Higgins got their start. An article from 1942 states specifically that Charles A. Higgins conducts services for persons of all faiths. We've seen that Higgins' Home for Funerals is the first place to check for Jewish funerals held in the area. Here's a newspaper article about James M. Pettit. Sometimes we're lucky enough to find an announcement of the start or end of a funeral home, but not as often as we'd like. An article announcing the opening of a funeral home by Andrew Brown in 1922 is only a single sentence, but still helpful. This article from 1922 announces that a Plainfield woman, Wilhelmina Woody, has applied for licensing with the Board of Undertakers and Embalmers. It says that she's taken a test and performed demonstration work. Before this point, we have a reference to her having worked with Leonard C. Morse, another undertaker. Following this, we found an obituary which gives her address as the location of a funeral. Funeral homes were usually not identified in obituaries at the time, making it harder to track their existence in cases in which they may have operated by word of mouth rather than published advertisements that can be found in researching them. Not quite 2 years after the licensing article, Wilhelmina Woody is being shut down, charged with conducting her business without a license. There's no explanation, but years later, in her own 1950 obituary, Wilhelmina Woody will be identified as a former funeral home director of Plainfield. In the case of Tilly Riker, her own obituary was a source of information about her time as an even earlier female undertaker. She took over a funeral home after the death of her husband. At her own early death in 1900, the Riker Funeral Home apparently closed. The library is fortunate in having 3 different newspapers for the time, but only the Daily Press included mention of her business in her obituary, and no article yet found announces the closing of the Riker Funeral Home. It's simply dropped from business listings. This newspaper advertisement includes a photo of the Judkins Funeral Home of 1933. The photo of their building must have been more clear in the original newspaper, but we still get an idea of the appearance of the building. We're very lucky to also have a small collection of photographs of Judkins Colonial Funeral Home that were donated to the library from the work of local photographer Paul Collier. Here we can see some of the alterations that have been made to the building as the business appears to have expanded. A photo from about 40 years later was taken by the Courier News and shows the A.M. Runyon and Son Funeral Home. It was sold that same year. A.M. Runyon was Alexander Manning Runyon. Research indicates that before he opened his own funeral home, he was employed by Oliver Runyon of Runyon's Funeral Home. We've eliminated the 2 Runyon men as brothers and father and son, but the actual relationship between the 2, if any, remains a mystery. This promotional article about DeMott and Lambert appeared in a 1903 publication, which has been recently digitized and added to the library's collection. It provides a nice image of the business entrance, to which Lambert's name has not yet been added. 1903 was the year that James Lambert married Kizzy DeMott, Henry DeMott's daughter. The business partnership appears to have been very brief, because a newspaper article from August of 1904 states that the Lamberts would be moving to Westfield, where James Lambert will engage in the undertaking business. City directories are not just worthwhile for their advertisements. This Newark directory, accessed through the library's subscription to Ancestry Library Edition, provides a listing for Charles B. Dennis in 1903. Only his home address is given in the Newark directory because he worked in Plainfield. Here in the classified section of the 1903 Plainfield City Directory, Charles Dennis is shown with his work address at 115 Madison Avenue. This is another city directory advertisement, this time for Oliver Runyon in 1872. Like many undertakers of the time, he was also a furniture dealer, and this advertisement, along with those that ran in the newspapers, emphasizes the furnishings he offered. Here he's included his home address because he was available as an undertaker at all hours. The business address is the north side of Front Street near Somerset Street. It must have been clear to people back in 1872, but is harder to place now. A further clue about Oliver Runyon's funeral home was revealed in the obituary of a firefighter, which was published just over 60 years later. Here we're told that a terrible fire destroyed the block that included Oliver Runyon's furniture store in about 1870. Imprecise dates and addresses mean that we can't tell whether the business we saw advertised in the city directory in 1872 was in a rebuilt building or whether the fire hadn't actually occurred yet. Jws Martin is the earliest Plainfield undertaker who's been discovered so far. In this 1849 newspaper ad, he went on to describe his furniture options, which we did not take the space to include here. Promoting himself as someone who has given entire satisfaction in every case, he also says that he's been connected with the undertaking and furnishing business for 5 years. The 1850 census provides some further clues with its listing of J. Warren Scott Martin, a cabinet maker. His age is clearly written as 22, so we can wonder if he began his 5 years of work, noted in 1849, as an apprentice. An earlier newspaper advertisement says that he has received private instruction from the most experienced undertaker in the city of New York. He's no longer found in Plainfield by the time of the 1860 census. Back on the genealogy tab of the Collections Index, we can find another resource for funeral homes. It's a collection of records generously donated by Memorial Funeral Home and includes records from some additional funeral homes which had earlier merged with them. Actual funeral home records might seem like a good source of information about the funeral homes, but they're a much better source for information about the people whose funerals were handled. These are wonderful to consult, but were not created with the researchers of the future in mind. They leave out details that would have seemed too obvious at the time the records were being created. Click on the icon to the far left to go directly to the Memorial Funeral Home collection. The collection is very large and still being processed. For that reason, you should always contact the library if you don't find something you're looking for in the online indexes, and we can look at the records for you. Only the top of the listings for this collection is shown here. There are several more sets of records that don't fit on the slide. Right now, we're going to take a look at the A.M. Runyon Memorial Funeral Home Card Index spreadsheet. As you can tell from its name, it was made from a card file and is necessary because the actual records are arranged in chronological order. This shot is a part of the first page of 258 pages for this spreadsheet. It shows last name, first name, and last name again. The fourth column is the file number assigned by the funeral home, and the fifth column is the date of death. Further columns for this for address and notes were not included in the shot for this slide. In this case, I'd like to draw your attention to Kitty P. Ackerman right in the middle. We'll be seeing her again later in the presentation. This is a sample page from the Memorial Funeral Home collection. These pages have not been added to the library's website. This page has been digitized for the presentation. It's in a ledger created by the High and Harold Funeral Home in 1920. In this ledger, each person has a page with standard blanks to be filled in. This close-up of the top of the page lets us read the name of the deceased person and some basic information like date of death. On the right side of the page, we can see the burial place identified as Hillside Cemetery, but important details for grave or lot number, section, and location of grave are blank. The box at the bottom right has not been filled in with placement information. This is very common for the records we see, although the absence can be frustrating for the researcher. Lower on the page are some more valuable details that may or may not have been included in any obituary. Note that at the top of this part of the page, we're given an exact age at time of death. Nowhere on the page is date of birth provided, although it had to have been used to calculate the exact age. Fortunately, there are a number of birth date calculators available online. Here on timeanddate.com, we've entered the information we have and we're told that Tabitha McGinnis was born on either July 28, 1849 or July 30th, 1849, depending on how the exact age was calculated by the funeral home. On our third and final visit to the genealogy tab, we're going to now choose the cemetery spreadsheet. The cemetery spreadsheet is straightforward and gives the name and address, followed by the contact information, owner, and years of operation. Information about where you can find cemetery records can be found on a further spreadsheet by clicking at the top to open the PDF file. That's where the library identifies any online resources available on the library website, print resources available at the library, any records known to be held elsewhere, whether the burial place is covered on Find a Grave, and any additional notes there might be. We won't look at that now because the number of columns doesn't fit easily on a slide. For the cemeteries, little information was found in advertisements, but here's one for what is now known as Rosedale and Rose Hill Cemetery in Linden. A great source of information is this guide to the burial places of Middlesex County, written by Edward Razor and published by the Genealogical Society of New Jersey. Although we regret that there is no similar guide for us here in Union County, there have been many Plainfielders buried past the borders into Middlesex County over the years, and we're happy to include this book among our resources. The Genealogical Society of New Jersey also offers an online resources in this index to their holdings of cemetery records and transcriptions for the state. It's available to everyone, not just members, and can be found under their drop-down menu for GSNJ collections, then under Collections, Indexes, and Finding Aids. The records and transcriptions themselves have been temporarily moved to the New Jersey State Archives in Trenton. Researchers who are unable to make the trip to Trenton can request copies from the Society. But some of the transcriptions included in the indexes have been published in the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey, which is available at Plainfield Public Library. Using this print index to the magazine for the years of 1925 through 1960, we can find a listing of gravestone inscriptions for the Runyon family burying ground in Piscataway. This is the transcription for the Runyon family burying ground. It's a very small place, so this item in the April 1941 issue of the Genealogical Magazine is able to tell us the cemetery location and give a description, accurate at that time, and list the burials on one page. Another website is helpful for researchers interested in the Jewish cemeteries which have served Plainfield. Here is the Friends of New Jersey Jewish Cemeteries website. At this point, it doesn't offer a list of burials, but it does include some photos of the cemeteries and should be a source for news and updates as they appear. Maps are a great resource for genealogists, and this Funeral Homes and Cemeteries webinar includes several cemetery images taken from this map, which has been digitized and posted on the library website. It's widely known as the Dunham Atlas and shows Plainfield and North Plainfield in 1894. This image from the atlas shows us some of the many changes to Brook Avenue Cemetery over the last 128 years. It's identified as the Presbyterian Cemetery on the map. To start, while the cemetery hasn't moved, it's no longer on Chatham Street, as the map says, and the large pond across from what is now known as Brook Avenue is long gone. If you look to the right of the pond to the pink building on top, you can see a former location for the Presbyterian Church, just over the dotted border between Plainfield and North Plainfield, and at this time, much closer to its cemetery. This is a photograph of the cemetery taken early in the spring of 2022. It's taken from outside the fence on Brook Avenue. A newspaper article from 1935 with an accompanying but undated photo fills in some of the cemetery's history. This portion of a map of the cemetery fills in some details by numbering the plots and identifying their owners. Evergreen Cemetery can be found on Plainfield Avenue, as it was in the atlas, although descriptions of its early history explain that it was considered to be outside of the town at first. Here we can see that even back in 1894, the city has grown to surround the cemetery. The Baptist section is north of the Methodist section. This map from 1872 shows that the earlier name for Plainfield Avenue was William Street, and it makes a distinction between the Methodist Episcopal Cemetery and Evergreen Cemetery. The cemetery looks beautiful on a sunny spring day looking in from Plainfield Avenue, but many flattened markers can be seen which are typical of this cemetery. Age is an issue here, but vandalism has been a problem for a surprising number of years as well. This newspaper photo from 1965 shows what's being called considerable damage. Another article describes damage to stone markers from deliberate chipping and red paint. That other article was printed in April of 1897 and also complained about cows, which were permitted to roam the grounds at will. An article from 1899 tells of the relocation of 240 bodies from the most southern end of the cemetery in order that the land could be sold and the money used to make improvements. Further articles indicate that the changes made included the building of an on-site home for a caretaker and the creation of a map to clarify the layout. Thanks to the generosity of local researchers, the library has been able to post a digitized copy of the Methodist Episcopal Map and create an index to the names it includes. The map is believed to have been created in 1900 and does not include individual graves. This is the top of the first of 5 pages of index. It shows the name of the owner as best we could interpret the handwriting, any clarification of abbreviations used in names, and the location. Sections are labeled on the map. The number following the section in the index we believe is for the plot. The map used for indexing was scanned in 2 parts, indicated here as Map 1 and Map 2. We've chosen J.C. Ackerman randomly to use as an example as the first name on the list. Because of its size, the map on the library website is shown as a single image, and it has been converted to a positive image. This negative version of the map can be consulted in the library. This is a portion of the map which includes Section 10, where we can find J.C. Ackerman in the top row center. A closer view allows us to decide if we agree with the handwriting interpretation. The number 12 we take to be the identifying number we've given in the index. We think the 26 and the 15 are measurements. While it's impossible to say with confidence that J.C. Ackerman is buried here and was not merely the owner, we decided to see if we could learn more about this person in order to put some of our resources to use. The exercise opened a mystery which remains unresolved. A man named John C. Ackerman died in 1910. A brief follow-up to his earlier obituary tells us that he died in Rochester, the son of Mr. and Mrs. John J. Ackerman, and was to be buried in Hillside Cemetery. But the next day, another article says that burial was made in Evergreen Cemetery. Everything else matches between the 2 articles, so we might look for confirmation on Find a Grave that we have the right person and that he really is buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Find a Grave makes no distinction between the different sections in Evergreen Cemetery. But there we can find no John C. or J.C. Ackerman, although we know John C. was reportedly buried there in 1910. Remember all those damaged grave markers. There are 8 names listed on Find a Grave for Evergreen Cemetery with the first initials of J.C., 4 of them for other John C.'s. But the only clue of value is the presence of John Joseph Ackerman, whom we know to be the father of the John C. who died in Rochester. A nice photo has been posted here for his entry, and another one for the mother of John C., but is obscured by our arrow because we didn't ask permission to show it. Fortunately, the library does have some additional resources to consult before we have to give up on resolving this mystery. Nancy from the Drake House Museum shared with us a photocopy of burials at Evergreen Cemetery that is one of the transcriptions held by the Genealogical Society of New Jersey. The list appears to have been made in 1948. On the bottom of this page, we can see a grouping of the Ackerman family. Brackets join the parents, John J. and Catherine P. Sharp Ackerman. She's the Kitty P. Ackerman we saw among the Runyon card file index entries earlier. Below this couple are their 3 sons, John C., Liston, and James. This seems helpful, but look at the top of the page. Although partially cut off by the photocopier, it clearly says these records are for the Baptist Cemetery in section 1 within Circle of Plots. The map we found J.C. Ackerman on was the Methodist map. The library, again, is very fortunate to have a map to the Baptist part of Evergreen Cemetery. It's not a very clear map, but this is the entrance showing Plainfield Avenue. And here is section 1 and a portion of the names within the circle, cropped to provide an image which can be read on this slide. A careful review of the full paper map does not reveal the Ackerman name. The area numbered 41 is blank, but nothing further can be determined from this map. Whether or not John C. Ackerman, who died in Rochester, is the J.C. Ackerman on the Methodist map is still not resolved. Let's return to his obituary. This time we're looking at the clergyman who conducted the services. He's Reverend Joseph O. McKelvey, and in 1910, Warren Chapel was a Presbyterian house of worship, becoming the Watchung Avenue Presbyterian Church in 1916, neither Baptist nor Methodist. So we're unable to use this information to help us clarify which part of Evergreen Cemetery holds John C. Ackerman. Garrett C. Ackerman appears to have been another brother to our John C. Ackerman, but is also not helpful in our search. He was not included in the listings for the family plot that we saw on the Baptist list of burials, even though he died in 1933, and we believe the list was made in 1948. He's also missing from Find a Grave in any cemetery. Had this obituary told us where in Evergreen Cemetery the family plot could be found, it would have been much appreciated. Finally, the funeral home record for Kitty P. Sharp Ackerman. In a rare case of some of the appropriate section of the funeral home record form to be filled out, we can see that the cemetery is Evergreen and the lot owner is identified as her late husband, John J. Any thoughts about the handwriting? My best interpretation of the handwriting inside the box is new headstone, open grave next to John J. on left. Section and number remain blank. It looks like John C. is buried in the Baptist section, but that we'll have to wait until some future point to answer the mystery of J.C. Ackerman. St. Mary's Cemetery is on the east side of the city. The cemetery now continues to Hill Street at the top of the map. In this view, we can see a building there in 1894, but it isn't there today. It may have been the new tool house mentioned in an 1887 newspaper article. Another mystery waiting to be resolved is the date when this cemetery was first created. We find it on the map from 1872, but can't yet confirm anything earlier. Newspaper coverage doesn't provide any additional information, and most of our early maps don't show cemeteries. This is another early spring view showing the entrance to today's St. Mary's Cemetery. It looks in from the gates on Berkman Street. This view is from outside the fence on St. Mary's Avenue, looking north. The Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery is no longer in existence. The Dunham Atlas shows it within view of today's library, which now takes up the entire block above the park. You can see the Orville T. Waring Mansion just above the cemetery. That's the building which later became the home of A.M. Runyon and Sons Funeral Home. Burials were removed from the Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery in 1903. They were relocated to Hillside Cemetery and the land used to expand the high school. This article explains that the cemetery had fallen into disuse. Things were different back in 1886 when former Mayor Maxson was buried there. The article about his funeral was a long one on the front page of the paper. At the bottom of the article, we're told that a large crowd escorted the body to the Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery for the burial. But a year and a half later, a single sentence announces his removal to Hillside Cemetery, 16 years before the Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery is closed down. This kind of situation is why we recommend that researchers consider Hillside Cemetery a possibility even for people who died before it opened in 1886. This map of Hillside Cemetery can be found on the last page of the Dunham Atlas. It's a small map, but we're only looking at a corner of it, so some of the names can be read. And this is a map of the soldiers' plot at Hillside Cemetery. The full chart belongs to the Historical Society of Plainfield and was created by the Winfield Scott GAR post. It appears to show the burials of their Civil War veteran members there up through 1922. This close-up shows some of the detail that's been recorded on the chart. It's surprising to see that the cemetery of the Plainfield Friends does not appear in the Dunham Atlas, even though we'll see in a moment that its earliest stone dates to 1815, and it's believed that there were burials there many years before that. The cemetery is located in the southeast corner of the block we see here, bordered by Church Street and East 3rd near the train tracks. This shot was taken from outside the fence on Church Street. The tan building belongs to the Friends and blocks our view of the historic meeting house. In the far background on the right is the post office, which was not present yet in 1894. This description of the cemetery was published in a 1972 issue of the Genealogical Magazine and was a source of the 1815 date for the earliest existing marker. The library's cemetery spreadsheet gives a beginning date of 1788 for the cemetery itself, following information provided in a history and listing of burials that was published in 1998 and copyrighted by the Rahway and Plainfield Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. Following the introduction, the transcription begins. In a test of whether Find a Grave would have listed people who do not have stones, Evelyn Keterling, the top name on the list, was at first determined to be missing from Find a Grave. However, it appears that spelling of her first name was not consistent across all records, and an entry for her can be found on Find a Grave with a single N in Evelyn. There are several family burying grounds listed on the library spreadsheet. This sheriff's sale from 1890 announces the sale of property which included a burying ground which still existed at that time. Within a detailed description of the property is mention of the coal burying ground. Access to this part of the property is required as part of the sale. No ledgers are likely to have ever been created to record the burials here, but the library does have a list of 9 burials which were recorded by a visitor to the burial place in 1925. An additional name was noted in the file the library keeps when an obituary was discovered which states that a Jacob Cole, not mentioned among the original 9, was buried there in 1894. At this time, it's unknown whether he ever had a marker to be found by the visitor, whether one was destroyed or stolen before 1925 or simply missed by the person who made the transcriptions, or whether the burial and marker were moved elsewhere before that time. This map of Essex County shows the presumed general location of the Cole family burying ground on the far northeastern part of what is now the city of Plainfield in Union County. Tantalizing clues point to the existence of a burial place of enslaved people on the grounds of the Martin family. The Dunham Atlas shows us only very generally where this burial place may have been. An article of 1969 describes the burying ground as having left signs near the Cedar Brook on land now bounded by Park, Crescent, and Watchung Avenues. The Dunham Atlas is, of course, from 75 years before that article, but here we can see the brook as a winding thin blue line running through the estate of Daniel Martin. The actual location of this burial place remains elusive, but is much wanted by researchers. This presentation was originally going to end with an additional image from the Dunham Atlas, which shows the grounds of another long-gone family burial place, this one on the far western edge of Plainfield. The information we have today about the burials which took place there so many years ago is sadly limited and representative of all we're trying to discover and collect. But it's a little frustrating, and I'd like to end instead with the Vermeule family burial ground, photographed early on Memorial Day of this year. It's being well cared for and is a pleasure to visit in its sheltered spot in North Plainfield. The file maintained by the library for this cemetery also includes a map for this special burial place, one limited to names recorded at a certain point and apparently missing further names, as is the case for all of the maps. May additional records turn up and our files grow thicker with more information in the future. And anyone who's able to contribute details or corrections to the information we have now is warmly urged to do so. Thank you for joining me for today's program. I hope you found it informative.